Okay, so good to see you. We're on the air now, I think, okay. And so it was really good. We had a good time last night with Jarrell.
Yes,
it was good, Jarrell.
Thank you for having me.
I think she may become a producer here, which would be very good. It'd be nice. Maybe you could too. Maybe it's a thought. Anyway, within public access and in the audience, welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program a young man that I've come in association with more recently, and that through the association I've had over a longer term. For those of you who may have viewed conversations with Rodney Shakespeare, who is a tutor and a academic from Cambridge University into Cambridge, and is the co-author of a book called Binary Economics, The New Paradigm, that was co-authored by Rodney and also by Robert Ashford. And he's in association with Rodney. Rodney recommended him to me, and I got in touch with you, and I'm so glad that Rodney let me know about you were out there in Brooklyn so we could get in touch to make this program.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
I really enjoyed our telephone conversation.
It was fabulous, yes.
I would say off the outset, his name is Younus Abdullah Muhammad, and he has a website. It's got a very interesting title. Mm-hmm. It's revolutionmuslim.com. That's pretty easy to remember. revolutionmuslim.com. That's his website. It's called that. It's very interesting. It's got a great deal of interesting material there. And he is in association with Rodney Shakespeare from an Islamic perspective, and also from an understanding of economics, and particularly the sort of arcane, yet I think destined to become the system that's going to be informing the world economy, this binary economic notion, and all of that we're going to talk about.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, share with us a little bit your own background, personal. You're young now, but share your own background.
Well, I was born and raised in America, and I am the convert to Islam. So 10 years ago, I became Muslim by choice after investigation of several religious ideologies, and stumbled upon the miracle that is represented by the Islamic religion, and came to accept it as my religion, and came soon thereafter to discover that Islam represents a complete, comprehensive way of life, which includes an economic system, a social system, a political system, and a system of legislation by which every Muslim considers divine. So we call this the shariah.
And Sharia is the way, I think.
Sharia, technically from a linguistic sense, it means the water hole that the animals will gather downstream to drink at. So it provides the fruit and the fruition by which the one seeking information about the Creator can come to discover Him through this system of law that was revealed to the Prophet
Muhammad. I want to get back to your background, but Saib, are you familiar with Noah Feldman?
Yes, Noah Feldman.
No, he wrote a
Jewish scholar that wrote a very interesting book about the decline of Islamic civilization. I can't remember the name.
Yeah, but he's a scholar and everything. He wrote a piece in the New York Times that was very interesting in the magazine.
An editorial.
And it was a long article in the New York Times magazine some years back, a couple of years or three. And he said that he talked about Sharia, and he says, in a certain sense, because he was law and everything, and he said, in a certain sense, it is the idea of Sharia is comparable. He was trying to make the argument comparable to what some people would call a rule of law or a system.
Not comparable. It is an effective rule of law.
But so
it has very clear rules and regulations as to how law is made with the human intellect versus what was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad through what we call Quran and Hadith.
Right.
But I think the important distinction that he made was that it was something that the West did not need to be fearful of as it embarked upon, and he wrote this editorial.
Yeah, he tried to make that point.
During President Bush's foreign policy doctrine of democratization of the Middle East, which was going to, he, I think, thought and feared that the fact that the Muslims would view this as forced secularization and democratization without a backing in Islamic ideology would create the sort of violence that actually indeed was created.
Or even a scholarly understanding of Islam.
And he had an excellent understanding of Islam.
You got nearly a quarter of the world population is Islamic.
20
That's
to 25%
huge swath of humanity.
From most assessments.
With great cultural differences, so there's a great deal of differences around
Absolutely.
it.
But Islam respects these differences, and that's what most people don't understand.
That's interesting.
And they think of this...
big tent, they would call it, or a big umbrella.
Well, indeed.
A lot can get under there.
Allah says in the Quran that He created men, all of men, from one father, Adam, and his mate, Eve. And we call this in Arabic, Bani Adam, the tribe of Adam. So we are all the tribe of Adam. And God says in the Quran that He created men in different colors, cultures, customs, and tongues, not so that they can dominate one another or be gathered together in one collective similar unit, but so that they can travel around and get to know one another. And this is accepted by all of Muslims across the globe. So Islam has certain tenets and universal principles that we accept as true, like taking the interest out of the economic system.
Okay, you're getting ahead.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people will talk to Sharia, they'll think Sharia, because there's a great deal, it used to be, you're too young to remember, but it used to be in terms of the people who see the world geopolitically and so forth, that there was an established order, coming out of history, constitution, all that kind of thing. And then you had a capitalist system that was there and a lot of interest in that and a lot of geopolitical interest around the world. And the enemy du jour then of the 50s and 60s was communism. We had communism, George Kennan and the containment. And there was a lot of always attendant upon that. There was a COINTELPRO investigation of communist connection. We had Joseph McCarthy in the 50s who went far down toward fascism and so forth. But now the enemy du jour seems to be, in a very real sense, Islam. Because that's taken the place of the communist. And there's a great deal of propaganda that we are submitted to in terms of that, where they take a certain thing, somebody's going to cut off a hand, or and they're propagandizing it, and they're running a campaign of propaganda against the enemy du jour, which has become, in the minds of many, Islam.
Well, it certainly has transferred. Thus the title of the website, Revolution Muslim. What we have is we don't want to run away from this idea that Islam does not pose a paradigmatic threat to the West, because in fact
I think
it does.
That's good. There should be
and
one
we
from
want
somewhere.
that to be well known. And we want that to come
where
out.
else is it going to come
that
from?
It is, and revolution, from a political science definition, actually represents the complete replacement of one system with another system.
Is that like paradigm shift, or is that too broad?
Thomas Kuhn's theory applies. I think from the scientific realm, you could transfer that across to political science, which is less purely scientific. But certainly, we see the world moving in a direction, I think, that suggests that we're embarking upon this path of an awareness by the general mass of humanity that the dominant paradigm does not serve the interests of them. And once you have this, you have people start to look for answers and questions. And as you suggested, with 1.5 billion people in the world under the umbrella of Islam, we have an opportunity to investigate this phenomenon as an alternative.
Where else is there any alternative coming from the normally accepted? And then each system that's in place, I suppose the emperors of Rome thought of themselves as legitimate, and that you've got a thing, the kings of England with their dynastic states thought they were legitimate. Now we have a system that's largely set up on a globalizing pattern of globalization, and it's all on economics, and the American system that has been adopted more or less, the canon of the economics since Adam Smith and so forth has more or less been accepted, and that the countries around the world that are in association with the United States are, the Marxists would call them running dogs. They go along with the United States, and they follow the pattern that's set up by the United States and her allies, and the United States thinks of itself as the legitimate movement of history, and things that are outside of that are illegitimate, whereas there's a great number of people who think there has to be a qualitative transformation, and that the system that the United States says is historically legitimate is not. It does not have a system adequate to what the future requires for humanity. A paradigm of paradigm shifts has to occur, and the impetus for that very well might come from the scholarly components of the Islamic world. Does that make any sense to you? And is there a need to challenge it at the level of the illegitimacy of what they have for operating geopolitically this planet?
Well, absolutely, and thus the term revolution, which scares a lot of people.
Yeah,
right?
well, it is a scary term.
But if humanity needs to organize itself under a collective obstacle or over a conscious movement that opposes what we see exist in the world right now, then Islam offers it a complete system, as I said before, a comprehensive system, and a system that when you take away the ideological attachment or maybe the religious affinity for it or toward it, when you weigh it objectively, you will find that many of the tenets in Islam offer the antitheses to what is being promoted by the United States-run global empire, economically termed globalization as it exists now. So as you made a reference to the idea that when the USSR and communism fell in 1989, 1989, we had theorists like Francis Fukuyama write his classic work that it was the end of history, that liberal democracy was now going to be the norm.
That's it. There was triumphalism.
2009 is witnessing an era where this is not the case. And humanity is becoming aware that this is not the case. From nation states like China and Russia and India, which are collectively sort of trying to form collaborative efforts to sort of combat.
But they all go along with it.
But they go along with it.
They go along with our paradigm.
They have to.
I saw Mr.
They
Hu.
have to.
I saw Mr. Hu talking to. He assembled a huge hall. With
Sure.
We represent Karl Marx.
And
we represent socialism.
They all represent the same empire and the same monetarist imperialist system that is run by the dollar bill, which is sitting in their central banks, which means that if the dollar loses its value, then the entire economy of their nation and the entire wealth of their elite loses its value because it's just paper. So they don't have the gold to swap for the dollars.
Well, that's a fine point to be put on something like that.
That's why they have to go along. They don't necessarily want to go along, but there's no alternative. So when you saw China suggest in 2008, the end of towards 2008, I believe, they made a suggestion that was accepted by Timothy Geithner for a day and then pulled back because the dollar started to drop rapidly, that they were going to use the IMF swap system for currencies, which would not back everyone's central bank in dollar bills and would allow currencies to sort of be functioning in a different way.
Well, free floating, not free floating.
No, not free floating, but I forget the term, but I think it's a. I cannot remember.
Special drawing rights?
Special drawing rights,
yeah, right,
exactly,
right,
yes.
Right,
I'm sorry. Where all currencies would have equal access to be the reserve currency of choice, more so than just having this system in place now, where the dollar, because the dollar is the world's global reserve currency.
For now,
what you have, it has to be unless the whole system crumbles.
Well, the whole system may be in threat of crumbling.
It is threatened, and that's what people are aware, and the elite are more aware than anyone else, and they know that this bailout is only to preserve the structure as it exists, but in no way, shape, or form have they come up with a solution to the ills and afflictions. And all this talk of recovery and nonsense that's going on in the world right now only is to preserve time and buy time for them to hope that things get better. But a monetarist system can indeed malfunction. It happened in Germany under hyperinflation, under the Weimar system, and it's happened throughout history when you look at the end of empires. For example, the Roman Empire, when it crumbled, it used to have gold and silver stacked backed currencies, and they were melted down and reprocessed so much so that the inflation was so rampant that part of the reason of their decline was a depreciation, hyperinflation, and a complete catastrophic collapse of their currency.
Yeah, empires rise and fall.
And we do see, and this is a system that is taught to us in Islam by the Quran and the words of Allah, which the Muslims consider the Quran to be His speech. And it is taught to us that we are supposed to, Allah gives us a command, and He says, travel around and see what was the end of those nations, those groups that came before you.
They're certainly beyond the racism, don't you think? Malcolm X learned that Islam...
this is part of it.
Like, what's his name?
It's an all-encompassing solution to today's ills and afflictions.
Pardon that
Every day I go into a masjid or a mosque, as most people are familiar with the term. I pray besides people that are black, that are brown, that are from different cultures, different colors, and different languages. And when I get up from my prayer, not only do I feel the peace of worshiping my Creator, but I feel the brotherhood of a community that is collectively gathered 5 times a day to pray beside each other to the one Creator that has created them. From that concept is a derivative system for the world.
You keep using derivatives. It's going to make me talk about swaps and derivatives.
Well, if we want to stay along the theme of economics.
No, it's worth talking about.
But it is worth talking about because swaps and derivatives are a consequence of the paradigm that it's imposed by this imperialist mentality and monetarist system. They have to continue to create ways to make profit. And the profit that they want...
haven't the capitalists always done that or wanted to?
But the innovations, as Paul Volcker just said, he said the greatest innovation...
It's good he's coming into the team now.
He completely dismantled and prepared the way for the world for the globalization that we see right now when he heightened interest rates under Carter and they started to ship industry overseas because if you
had to do something under Carter, he had 20% interest rate.
Inflation, and they did something. But they prepared the way for the deliberate dismantling of the industrial capacity of the United States.
It wasn't just a result of a certain technological capability that was growing.
It was a result of the Nixon administration.
We didn't have, but okay, it's good.
Pulling off of the...
Could we back up a little bit?
Sure,
That's really good, and that's all good. We'll get to these things.
There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to get it all into a sentence, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
You need to use haiku to try and get it in if you can. But back to your beginning. Before you did the... you studied... Did you study university? Were you... I hear tell you were a deadhead. You were involved with Jerry Garcia.
At one point in time, but consciously
countercultural.
Countercultural as a conscious decision as a youth growing up in America, noticing that there was nothing to be offered by the dominant paradigm. So searching. Quite naturally, I think.
In the counterculture, music counterculture, poetics, and
into anything. Into
Abby
spirituality.
Hoffman,
sure, we're familiar with all of these.
Yeah,
and we're familiar with this movement. How can you
not
be fascinated by what occurred in the United States?
There are some people
during the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
and the fact
it was
that the
amazing.
Mass mobilization of people was able to end the military-industrial complex's incessant destruction of an entire group of people, and the courage that those people exhibited in order to bring those troops home, and they played a major portion in that. But then, from that movement sprung sort of two directions. In many ways, the movement for justice in the world stopped and it ceased because they didn't want to change the paradigm. They just wanted to change certain things that were a byproduct of the paradigm.
Reform. Try to reform.
Yeah, they wanted more justice, they wanted more rights, but in the end they got assimilation and they became the very enemy that they were fighting against, seems to me. I wasn't alive during this era.
No,
but
you
I
weren't
came
alive.
up during and underneath a baby boomer generation that had completely compromised these values of the late 1960s and early 1970s.
I think we're going to live to see in the long sweep of history, we've been here 200,000 years, this species. Kind of a long run. 10,000 generations or so, and empires have come and gone and everything like that. We only had civilization for about 10,000 years, and you know things change and everything.
Sure.
But I think in the fullness of time, it's going to be seen that the year, like we say we're living in the year 2010 now, and that's a Christian thing. That's the birth of Christ, is set that. And it was a major event. That's the one that's accepted by a lot. Other people use other calendars and so forth.
Sure.
But I think in the fullness of time, I think the year 1970 in the fullness of time is going to be seen as a kind of year one.
And
when there was a transformation occurring in terms of the collective capability, of the unique capability of our species.
Okay.
Thinking almost in terms of evolutionary theory, the concept of punctuated equilibrium, that you come to a point of quantitative change, and then there's a qualitative change, and new species appear in so that.
Well, I think that the baby boomer generation and the byproducts of that certainly do represent a new species, for sure.
Well.
And I agree.
Okay.
I agree with the theme that and the direction that we're going in. Sure. Yes.
But there was something going on. Bobby Dylan wrote a song. There's something blowing in the wind.
There was many
a
things going on. But for me, the counterculture movement was in some ways hijacked by a very deliberate movement we call consumerism today. And that this sort of mentality of existential pleasures, do whatever makes you feel good.
Oh, be careful! They tried to put it down as sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
And
there was a lot of that.
And I think in a way that because it became about sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
But it did, no, wait a minute! Don't let that go. It was not. There were huge other things going on at that time.
Yes, we know this.
That have been overlooked. Like, for instance, the context in which the extended consciousness of the Homo sapien, to extend its consciousness into the environment through tools and technology.
Sure, yes.
Was coming to a point
but
where
the elite and the power structure certainly abused this sort of free-for-all moral concepts that were backing this movement of challenging the establishment became more about expressing yourself in any way you wanted. So it became about anti-technology, and there was a strand of it. And today I think it's becoming...
Well, you're talking about Islam being multifaceted,
sure.
So was the counterculture.
But
you had all things from anarchists to commies.
And we agree. I agree. And I agree that there's a very productive... you sitting in this chair, for example, for me is an example of what the counterculture could have become. And does represent, in fact.
Well, I was at Woodstock. I went to Woodstock, and there's a big red balloon that we put up that you can see, I think, on the cover of the album.
And I think that that's good.
For the people who are from Woodstock.
But I think that what became the dominant norm from this movement is a consumerist culture that believes that there is no real truth, that there is only subjective truth, so that human beings should do what they want. Now that runs coincident to the theory of capitalism that man should seek and compete for unlimited resources, for limited resources with unlimited desires. And it doesn't provide a pathway for people to be conscious about how their behavior has an external effect on the behavior and the life and the well-being of those outside a transaction between X and Y. What I'm trying to suggest is that the movement in some ways was adulterated. A certain faction of the movement.
That we're
then it was written into the history books as though this adulterated faction of the movement was in fact the movement, and all of the political, all of the movements that, for example, Malcolm X. We don't understand the true message that Malcolm X brought to this society today, nor do we understand the true message that Martin Luther King brought. We celebrate Martin Luther King's birthday as though he was a man that fought for racial equality.
Well, he did.
And he did. But
he
also knew that by fighting locally for racial equality, that was not his overall vision. He was looking to cease the way that the United States was functioning in the international arena, and he saw this movement towards imperialism.
He finally came out against the Vietnam War. And finally, it took a long time.
And Malcolm was forever critical of him. And without Malcolm in his ear and criticizing him, we wouldn't have this merger of ideologies that produced a real potential movement. But for me to look at the African Americans today and their well-being in this society and to suggest that they in some way, shape, or form have equality with the Caucasian counterparts that exist in the society is for me to be a completely blind. And this is just not the case. But we celebrate it. And we celebrate it as though this was an era of change, but the change occurred. But I think that the paradigm did indeed shift, but it became one of consumerism, and it became grounded in a moral theory of just do whatever makes you happy, and everything will work out. And I'm not so sure that that is the way.
So you're not so sure
individual freedom is fine.
So that you're not so sure that 2,000 years from now, things will be factored from the year one to was our year 1970.
I think that
that would indicate that these things you're talking about are questions of some changes.
I agree that these changes.
Some changes on the deck boat of the Titanic or something that's going on, but it wasn't talking about a paradigm
It didn't
shift.
Change. They shifted. The elite shifted, and they adulterated the paradigm.
No, you see, you're looking at it. I'm trying to say that 1970, there were much larger things going on and were being felt. Artists felt it.
I agree.
And so forth.
But we don't have that same vibration in 2010, so there's no continuation. And the generation that had the ability to change and stop the drift towards authoritarianism and the increasing authoritarianism, the increasing growth of power in the corporate machine, the increasing growth of power in the military-industrial complex, it was not successful. But it did start it set forth an example that the whole world learned by. For example, if someone was to tell you today that the jihadist movements or the Islamic movements were not in some way, shape, or form influenced by these movements for independence in the world as a byproduct of the end of imperialism in the 1950s, and as a byproduct of this Cold War influence and the end and the ability of the American liberal generation, the counterculture movement, to sort of use and accept some of those efforts of mobilization and efforts of movement towards justice as legitimate means by which they could effect change in their own societies, then they wouldn't be telling you the truth. A lot of people would like to suggest that Islam exists over here and the West exists over here. I don't think that's the case.
I've just been rereading Huntington, you know.
Which one? Clash of the Civilizations?
Yeah, just
it's a completely it's not a legitimate read on history.
No, I think it's interesting because he brings up some of these cultural things that are beyond the geopolitical things that all of the realpolitik and all of that, and thinking about things in economic terms. We want to get to economic terms,
sure.
But there are cultural differences between the people that are very important. He calls them civilizations. It's interesting. But back again to the 1970 thing, for whatever it's worth, I think that's destined 2,000 years from now. That's likely to be seen as year one.
Okay.
Because they will come upon, and we're not talking about the reality. You're not talking about the reality. And the human beings, or the Homo sapien, has a unique capability to all the creatures, I would suggest. I don't know. Ants are very clever at making tunnels and everything like that. And beavers do make dams, and birds make nests. But the human being, the unique thing, I was thinking about it the other day. I'm going to do a program in a couple of days with the Georgist, Henry George, and he said that all the resources should be collectively owned by everybody. That was his theme back in the turn of the 19th century. And people born out of evolution, we came up, Ardipithecus was our ancestor apparently, and 200,000 years the Homo sapien appeared, and all the resources were here to the cavemen. And what has changed has been the ability of to extend our capability into the environment through tools clubs, we could hit each other on the head or something. And then technology, that's what's changed our relationship through time.
Sure.
And that extension of that capability of creating an environment other than in an Eden-like sense is given was something, it took a long time. 190,000 years before there even began to be a pure food quest and so forth. It was about 100 billion people, it's estimated, have lived in the whole course of the Homo sapien.
The Homo sapien.
Yeah,
extracting the theory of evolution and just this species that we know.
And they have, and that we've reached a point. And so what that is, that's a capability that is characteristic of the extended capability.
I agree.
And it has certain kinds of consequences in terms of economics and certain consequences in terms of politics and other things that you're talking about largely. And those things, there was something major that was going on as we reached that point in 1970. One of them was, I would make the point, because I make it with Khalsa in mind, or with Islam, is that Bucky Fuller was among others. There were others, Bury Bookchin and others, are making. Let me make a proposition to you. Do you think it's possible, if you look through all of human history, that through the extension of technology, a higher a definition of terms, like you're in a debating society. Is there any point at all in ever trying to get down to defining something when we talk about a have and a have-not, in terms of the haves and have-nots in the world?
Well, I think
because you have all kinds of, you're not a have unless you have a diamond, you have a swimming pool full of diamonds. But in a reasonable term, is it possible to have some reasonable explanation of, or explication of what it is to be a have as opposed to a have-not? And if it were, are there more haves than have-nots as we move through history on a percentage term, out of history and up into history and to the modern time?
So
you could have, you have one chart encompassing a whole bunch of paradigm stuff. That is, say, here's haves, here's have-nots, and you would have a chart that would, what percentage of the world population in terms of the technology
I understand what you're saying,
would be haves and have-nots. Fuller came up with such a chart, and he copyrighted in 1952 that we had come out of history less than 1%, and it was the technology going hyperbolic in our time, like the quickening in a pregnancy or the moving toward qualitative transformation in punctuated equilibrium. But he said we reached 10% about the First World War. It's all led by war. 20% by the Second World War, and we reached a point 30-odd% by the 1952. And that he
haves and have-nots.
He had haves on one side.
What about today? Are we qualitatively increasing?
I'm trying to get the point.
Go ahead.
So, and he projected it from 1952, and he said we were going to reach in 1950, around 1970, 20 years out, we were going to reach the point, and he's not talking the reality. The reality is all we were going to reach the point where, in terms of our capability, the have and have not, you have to get a definition of terms. How do you deal with all the conundrum, the changes or different opinions there, or how you define it? But you get, and that we were going to reach the point where there were more haves than have-nots. We're going to cross the 50% mark, and we were going to cross that line around 1972, and it might be accelerated a little bit. And we were going to, and as it he let out his life thinking, we crossed that line in the year 1970. That's one thing. That translates out in terms of capability. Not
potential.
Not the reality.
Yes, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but there's potential that's real in terms of what exists.
Yes,
you understand
we
what I'm
have
saying?
the potential to live in a world where distribution of wealth
but going back through all of history,
going
back through all of history, that was not the case. We were
not
coming
through
up
all
with
of history,
that's the point being made. Also, most of the research, systems research that takes, because the leading edge of technology has been largely at the behest of the leading countries or empires of the world that wanted to assert their own legitimacy, and they would give support first and foremost to the weapons makers, and the ones who could give them military advantage over others so they could steal the grain or get a better do. And that was like geopolitical reality and all of that, nation states, all that, and that was a bit operative.
Yes.
And those weapon systems collectively, most of the things, if you ask the serious question, is it possible that the weapon systems that exist, the potential, that if there was to be a miscalculation, guns of August, Barbara Tuchman, and those weapons were offset, let's say Israel lets off about 15 atomic bombs out of Tel Aviv towards all the
increasingly every day. Like this could be
that's just one. All right.
Go ahead.
If they were, and then there was it would have to be something that would unleash the weapons of the United States of America.
Yes.
Okay. If they did, would it mean the end of the entire Homo sapien species? There are studies that say that is the case, and we reached that point about 1970. So that we had a conundrum where we had a capability, literally, we couldn't do it in the Second World War.
Yes.
That's pretty recent in terms of 200,000 years.
In 1970.
Something big was going on.
So we reached a point where mankind was capable
we had capability.
We have the potential to go down one of two paths, where we can have an awakening of consciousness and an ultimate paradigmatic shift in human consciousness. Or we have the capability to blow up the entire world and destroy everything.
You're not going to destroy the whole world, but you're going to
humanity as we know it, civilization as we know it, enter into a global dark age and completely destroy the well-being of the majority of people on the planet.
But likely in the
potential is there.
Modeling,
the atomic bomb gave us that.
It wasn't there. No, if I may.
Yeah. In 1970, you're saying?
It was 1970. I'm making a point for 1970. 2,000 years from now, that's going to be seen as year one. That's what I'm going to say.
I'm not disagreeing with your point.
So that we live in a time, of qualitative transformation.
Yes.
In terms of our capability,
in
coming
terms
out
of potential and capability.
Yeah.
Sure, I agree with that. Qualitative change in potential and capability. But I would argue, where you suggested that there was just now this awakening awareness, and we've known from using things like evolutionary science that we share in the ability. You suggested that ants have the ability to build intelligent homes and diverse tunnels, and they actually live in a society, we know, with queens and soldiers, and they have this. The Quran told us this 1,400 years ago. And God says in the Quran that not an animal community have we not created that lives like you. So we have this conscious awakening a long time ago in the Muslim world.
We didn't have the conscious awakening.
We did.
No,
we did.
No, we didn't have the capability to destroy the species.
No, we didn't. No, but what I'm saying is, let's start from the beginning of your. Let's start from the beginning of your dialogue.
And if you're
and I will say that the quantitative shift in the world, the capability to promote justice and this distribution of wealth that you're suggesting in 1952 became plotted by an academic, I forget who you said, that he suggested that there was going to be a quantitative rise in the haves and the have-nots to the point where we had maybe an equitable distribution, the potential to have an equitable distribution.
That is not quite what I was saying. I was saying it was quite different from that. People have been saying the wisdom schools, Jesus said it, Buddha said it, Lao Tzu said it, Muhammad said it, be just, be good, let's be good, let's take care of the least among us, and you notice it's been roundly ignored by the political leadership of this planet, right up to, and it's being ignored now. And humanity as a whole.
But,
okay, that's the point.
But if we point to 1970 as the year where there was this qualitative shift in the potential to realize
let me suggest, what you're doing, if that's true, now it may not be, it'd be nice to mention once in a while, but if that were true, then you could say, and you'll get to economic theory, this is my thought.
Yes.
If you get to economic theory, we were transcending material scarcity as an ontologic reality for the first time in 200,000 years of human evolution.
Yes.
Couldn't have happened any time earlier from Jesus or Muhammad or anybody else.
Why not?
We didn't have the technological capability.
Was there a time under the Islamic Empire from eastern China all the way into northern Africa where there was anybody documented by history that had a want or a need for any economic scarcity?
Yeah, no, of course, because scarcity,
this was an age of complete.
I'm not talking only about you got food to eat, or you've got 2 goats, or you've got something like that you had.
But
out of that there was enough food,
been there for
and
a
even
long
there
time.
was justice. No, you didn't. It's knowledge. It's knowing. It's science. There's a long trail of science.
There's a long trail of history that has been largely written out of Western academic accounts of things like where capitalism came from. The reality of the matter is that the spreading of Islam from Saudi Arabia, what we call today Saudi Arabia, actually Mecca and Medina in the Arabian Peninsula, happened so transformatively fast that it occupied in spans of 70 years the entire Middle East, Northern Africa, all the way into China, Indonesia, and all the way north into Spain.
Right.
At the time when we look at these constructs and the derivatives that come from Islamic principles, like no interest in the economic system, and when we look
You're getting down to details.
We're getting down to
That's
details. But what
okay.
I'm suggesting is that rather than mankind look toward the developments that have occurred over the last 30 years, what Muslims would like to suggest that mankind try to do is stop this Orientalist mentality, or as you suggested, Samuel Huntington's ideology of this clash of civilizations, and look at the contributions that Islam has given. So you had Richard Bullitt on your show before in the 1980s.
A whole bunch of people.
Now he has this theory that we should call Western civilization, in fact, not Judeo-Christian civilization, but Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization. Why? Because all of the founding principles associated with capitalism and the growth of individual liberties and the growth of these mentalities actually do not start in the British Empire or in Europe per se, but largely what they try to do with Orientalist culture is they say that the Europeans picked up where the Greek left off.
Well, they have that,
And the Muslim world existed as a quite just and a quite civilized form of collective human organization for well over 1,200 years before it fell into decline.
No, I know that. And
so what we have to do,
had it before that.
and that's what the point is from a Muslim perspective is to let's not we need to learn how to live together, and Muslims knew how to live together with Christians and Jews.
How are you going to? Yeah, but. Before there was Karl Wittfogel. Karl Wittfogel, it was Mesopotamia.
Sure.
There were things before, long before Islam.
And there was empires that were based on monetary systems, just like we see today.
Well, you keep saying monetary systems. I don't know what that means.
A monetary system, let's say.
You think that's crucial to understand?
I think it's crucial to understand the way that we live today.
Monetarist system is paper money.
Monetarist system is a system that is associated with paper money that is controlled by a government, but the way that it functions is not just in that what happens is you have a private central bank. This is coming out of, you could go all the way back to Babylon if you want to look for the original roots of this mentality of what we term the fractional reserve model of issuance of currency into a system. So you have a private centralized bank, and this private centralized bank is responsible for the issuance of the money into the society. And it does so by giving direct access to credit and priority access to credit to the conventional banks that actually, if you really look at institutions like the Federal Reserve in the United States of America, the conventional banks that it loans money to are either the associates or they are the actual banks that control and share in the control over the Federal Reserve.
There's always been a leadership class that
and they have the ability to issue more paper than anything. It's not backed in anything, it's just backed in trust. And in order to create this sort of monetarist system, what they need to do is built upon the concept of empire. And if you can go all the way back to the point where the Islamic period went into decline. So we have a hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, a long hadith. And the angel Gabriel comes to the Prophet Muhammad to teach the people in man form. And he asked the Prophet Muhammad at the end about the end signs for the day of judgment, the end of the world, as all monotheistic traditions would have it, that there is this ultimate day of judgment, we will be resurrected, brought to account for our sins and deeds, etc., etc. And the Prophet Muhammad says that the questioner knows, the questioner and the one being questioned know nothing, basically saying that only God, the Creator, knows this answer. And he says, so give us the signs. And the Prophet Muhammad says to him that the barefoot Bedouin Arabs will compete with one another in the building of tall buildings, one. And number two, that the woman will give birth to her master. Now, there's many ways to interpret this in the end of times that we see, or in the reality we see today. So we can look at Dubai and the construction of the world's tallest building, for example, and you can make an analogy that this might be a suggestion and a fulfillment of what was said 1,400 plus years ago by the Prophet. But the one I'm interested in is this concept of this mother giving birth to the slave master. And I'm looking in reality when I study economic history, and I know all theory of capitalism begins with Wealth of Nations in 1776.
That's what I would
But I'm
assume,
telling you that Portugal and the Venetian and the Dutch and the British were all heavily influenced as imperialist models, were heavily influenced by the contact that they had with Muslims.
And I think the Muslims were influenced by what came out of Karl Wittfogel.
But the Muslims never had an idea of imperialism as promoted by the monetarist systems that we promote in the world today. So what we had with the beginning of, we have the Venetian oligarchy that was formatted, and we have the beginning of this concept of this private central bank, and it developed itself into the Bank of England, and it took off really legitimately where it almost controlled the whole world as a parasite with the foundation of the British Empire. Now, this is a monetarist system, meaning they want to control the currency and they want to control the world's dominant currency so that they can control the access to credit. So before we leeway into binary economics, we have two forms of production of wealth.
I'd like to
labor and capital. But when we look at the imperialist system, what we have is we have created a system of bankers or elitists or oligarchs that are able to sit outside the real economy and completely speculate on the entire well-being of not only the domestic economy, but the faraway economy. And this is the this is what a monetarist system represents. It actually is like a parasite in that not only does it need to exploit, right? But in the end, it can exploit the entire, as you say, it can lead to the entire destruction and falling.
I think power elites have exploited the people all throughout all of history. I don't think there's been any...
It's the systems by which man organizes themselves under that lead to paradigms.
I understand what you're saying.
And this is the dominant paradigm that promotes the ability of globalization to wreak havoc. Now, when we want to look for solutions, we look at the way that the Muslim empire functioned for...
I wouldn't.
Okay, that's fine. But I'm saying that the systems that are there, for example, this concept of a mudaraba transaction, where you have a mudarab who...
What's a mudarab?
It's a profit-sharing, equity-sharing model. And this is what gave birth to this concept of capitalist. Capitalist is one that has capital and seeks a means by which to turn profit. This was known in the Islamic world all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. But the problem is when the Arabs went and they sought to reach out and to discover Africa, they didn't talk in terms of we're going to exploit them, put them in slavery, and take all their natural resources back to the motherland. What they spoke of was we're going to develop them, and the first and primary important intention of the spread of Islam into Africa was to make the people Muslim. The same thing with when the Muslims conquered in Persia, with when the Muslims conquered in Byzantine. The system was not built on this ideology of we're going to go there for the sake of the pleasures and the wealth and the gold and the silver. This rampant idea of parasitic economic imperialism started with the European models coming from Portugal, going into the Dutch Empire, going then into the British Empire, and now today existing under the American system.
Well,
so
I agree with
it's
all
a big parasite.
I agree with all that, but that has nothing to do with what I was talking about.
No, but you asked about the monetarist system.
No, I didn't. You brought it up. I didn't ask about it. I was talking about a qualitative change at a whole other level. But that's okay.
I'm disagreeing because
that's okay.
Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to talk about this point that 1970 represents this beginning
I say
of a conscious awakening. I say that 1,400 plus years ago, the conscious awakening that occurred in human beings occurred when the Prophet Muhammad came.
Okay, you got that. I got mine. And I'll tell you one thing.
We have to make that fundamental distinction.
All right, that's fine. It's nice to talk about these things, and it's all in the realm of capability. I just noticed the Catholic Church didn't let Galileo and Copernicus off the hook until about 12 years ago for saying that we were not the center of the universe. Old paradigms, old thoughts, old
and that's
systems,
why many
old
people,
institutions
that's why many people
hard.
reject religion in the West.
Right,
because
and
of
should.
And should. Because
no, not only religions. Every single institution and everything is notions of human nature, all reading of history. If you're in one situation where you've had 200,000 years of scarcity in the collective capability,
we don't agree with
it is different. And it was not different until the year 1970 in terms of the collective technological capability with all the understanding that went with it and the science that came. We couldn't have done it at the time of Jesus. We couldn't have done it at the time. We couldn't blow up the world at the time of Muhammad. There was a different way. It was gestating.
Oh, I agree.
We were gestating.
We agree with this point.
So we're coming to a time of qualitative transformation. We're now at the point where we have the capability of joining entropy, blowing it all up, and we got the capability to do it. Couldn't do it as recently as the Second World War. We were trying.
Somewhat after the Second World War, during the Cold War,
we could to kill each other.
Sure.
We really were, and putting it full
because mankind was organized under this concept
Things changed after 1970 at the level of capability. It had nothing to do with the reality.
Right.
We inherited all kinds of institutions, all predicated upon the fundamental notion of scarcity.
Sure.
It was real.
Oh, yes, I agree.
After 1970, that no longer has to apply in terms of our capability.
It still does apply, and it is the reality.
No, but it took Galileo was not let off the hook until 12 years ago for making a qualitative change in the view of the universe that messed up people's sense of identity.
Sure.
We've got our sense of identity all wrapped up in these outdated institutions we've inherited out of gestation, and we have a system that is not relevant to what the future requires, because the future requires a liberation.
I agree, but
and
mankind has no organizing ideology around which to be liberated.
There's always been a few group who will control everything. Everybody else are serfs. They're wallowing around in the mud. There's ideas of things that can be projected, but they didn't have the capability.
They didn't have the capability
to.
I agree with this.
And we didn't have the capability on the destructive side. So, among other things that we knew, that's a premise. That's a premise. It can be laughed at.
Sure.
Because everybody says, how the hell can you say we got enough when you look around, everybody's starving?
Yes.
8/10 of the world is living on $2 a day.
That's because of the paradigm, and that's deliberate. Yes.
All right, and it's deliberate, and there's it's this fault, that fault.
Sure.
But the point is, that's the point. Then the question is, if that's the case, that's one premise. The other is, how are you going to set up an economic system? Mr. Keynes, for whatever it's worth, set up the whole monetary system that we live with now, everything. And he said in 1930 in a letter to his grandchildren, this gets to practical.
Okay.
He said to a letter to his grandchildren, you're going to be confronted something in their maturity, that's about now, in terms of economics and development. We had a Great Depression in the United States and so forth, world. He said, you're going to be confronted with something that's very hard to understand, technologically induced, massive unemployment.
But what was his solution?
The solution was he didn't make a solution in that statement. He didn't make a solution in that statement.
Keynesian economics offers no real solution.
You'll know. Well, he made a lot of things when he set up the
stimulus in order to produce increased consumerism.
And it took a long time in order to do that. But he didn't make anything like that.
Job creation and stimulus packages, sort of like what Barack Obama is implementing now, which are failing utterly. He's going to give a State of the Union address tomorrow. He's in deep trouble with a lot of people. His speech tomorrow will sound wonderful. You know why? Because he lost power in that election in Massachusetts.
Well,
so
I know. Yeah, see, we're
now
right
the
down
speech.
to the minute.
Now the speech writers are going to write this beautiful populist speech that's only going to be typical Obama rhetoric.
Okay, he will be, and everybody else. Nobody else has.
But the majority of the world will believe it.
But nobody has relevance. Because they're going to be talking about what they're looking for.
Job creation.
They're going to job creation,
and that's where we get down to binary economics.
For the 90% of the people in all of the world, 95% of the people in all of the world, you have the only way you're going to have income.
Yes.
Legitimately to buy a little bread
and
maybe a little pound cake on Sunday if you're really good is to have a job.
We agree.
On it within a context where the capital assets are increasingly displacing the labor input, displacing the means by which displacing the way in which we distribute demand or capability to the people, and we're built into that, and we have no other way to distribute income and also have capital equity.
We have plenty of other ways to. We have plenty of other ways to distribute.
Okay,
income.
how?
Well, we'll talk along the lines of binary economics.
Well, yeah, but binary economics is very isolated.
It is isolated, but it doesn't need to be isolated.
Do you ever hear anybody talk in the
never
about anything other than creating jobs? They're going to be displaced
because they have a fundamental misunderstanding of economics.
Because they don't have a right economic system.
And because they went to Harvard and they went to Columbia and they listened to what their professor said, and all of the years of scholarship have written off most of the other alternative ideologies that have entered the academic realm that offer a realistic solution.
That's right. And
even people like Joseph Stiglitz that write articles called The Moral Bankruptcy of America, and they speak in terms of we. All these people are hypocrites. You know why?
Because not hypocrites.
No, they are hypocrites. Because they still buy into the belief that the paradigm as it exists actually can work, as long as it's properly regulated. But there's nothing that they say that would fundamentally change the distribution of wealth in the society.
But that doesn't mean that there isn't a crying need for there to be no paradigm's too brief.
Yes.
Paradigm of paradigm shifts. Yes. Liberation. Look, the positive side.
I think there's one
never
going
had. Let's make
I think there's one going on.
Why do they say we have a democracy? We do not have
I don't
anywhere
believe this is
a
anything
democracy.
Of a democracy.
We do not have a democracy
there's a great
anywhere
new book.
or never have had. We never have. Well, all we've had is a situation where there's always a ruling elite.
Yes.
And the people are wallowing around in the mud.
Sure.
And they're doing what they're told by. It might as well be a serf on a
As
feudal
Winston
state.
Churchill said, democracy is what? The best of all the worst forms of government.
All the others.
Except all the others.
And Gandhi said it would be nice if Western civilization
tried. If it actually tried.
But, okay, we know that. But the point is, they don't have a system that the future requires in the canon. And they accept the canon.
Well,
That's right, except maybe binary, and there might be something coming out of Islam.
Well, not something coming out of Islam, a major movement coming out of Islam.
Okay.
And it's not. And
how are we going to distribute income?
First, we have to fundamentally
how are we
organize
going to
human
distribute
behavior.
income to people by the way things are being produced? Capital instruments are producing the wealth.
Sure. Well,
how are we going to distribute buying power to the people so they can clear the market?
We're not, unless we have revolution.
Well, revolution. Okay, revolution would be just creating anarchy. That would be leading to bombs going off and destroying the species.
No.
How are we going to have a system that leads to
we see the unfolding of the destruction of an empire, and a paradigm shift is marked first by decline, and then an awareness that this decline is real, and then people actually act in survival instinct mode to wake up consciously and to advocate for change. Now, you have binary economics.
Okay,
right?
Now nobody that's watching here will know what the hell you're talking about.
I know. So
it doesn't have anything to do with Mr. Stiglitz or Obama or anybody.
We're trying to get to that point, but I'd like to argue that most of the principles associated with binary economics have already existed in the economic intention of the creator for the last preserved form of true economic system, the intention of the Creator revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and preserved in the Quran as only one work.
Okay.
Now, those concepts. Binary economics
First of all,
is premised on the fact.
Why don't you explain? You're going to be working with Rodney Shakespeare.
We hope so.
You're talking with a handful of people, talking about a handful of ideas that have no credence in terms of the ongoing political dialogue.
They do.
Hardly. They have a little,
do.
but they don't. But why don't you explain to the people here in the audience what binary is, how it is differentiated from just say the canon, from
capitalism and communism.
From
very
Adam
briefly.
Smith to Friedman, including Marx and all Keynes and all the rest.
Very briefly.
How does it differ? And then I want you to link it to aspects of the tradition of scholarship of Islam that would link binary, not the traditional canon, but binary.
Okay, so
other than morality.
Binary economics is based upon the premise that human beings have the potential to produce income from two sources. One is labor, and the other is capital.
Thank you.
Right? And so the problem is that, as you said, all of these, whether it's all the way on the left or all the way on the right, all of the economic theory concentrates on labor and doesn't look whatsoever at the distribution of capital, which takes away from the majority of mankind.
No, the capital is all concentrated.
The capital is concentrated because it doesn't look at the role of capital and the means by which you can distribute capital so that every human being can enjoy from two potential sources of income, labor and capital.
Okay.
So those sort of institutions, for example, the employment sharing involved in the modern modern corporate structure, where employees are actually able without savings to purchase a share in future income. This is a sort of non-authoritarian structure that is much better than going in and having somebody that's not affiliated with the company but is speculating outside of the company and working on Wall Street for a major mutual fund, give the resources, or the major investment bank or a major commercial bank, give the resources by which these huge multinational conglomerates continue to control the majority of capital in the world. Nobody wants to talk about it because the minute you do, you're out of a job. The minute you do, it's because of the authoritarian structures, because the power structure wants it to exist.
The power exists within with those who own the capital asset. All right, they set the template. They set the template for all the institutions.
So you can't speak of binary economics. But in Islam, to connect binary...
No, wait a minute. You're going a little too fast past binary.
So what
That's
else
a distinctive thing. There's an alternative way for people to have income in a serious way.
Yes.
And people have to have income because you got, in economics, very basic, you have to have supply. We have an incredible supply of capability that we have. We've reached a point where we could make this planet sing for everybody.
I agree.
Nobody has to be hungry. It was not the case in the past. In feudal times, everybody was starving.
I think that's true.
Okay.
But how do we get there is the question.
No, but that's
if we have a potential,
we have the capability,
or a capability.
We have the capability to, since 1970.
Then we have to have organizational structure by which we can organize mankind under, so that we can work toward achieving that objective.
So you have to have a way. You have to have supply. That's the capability to produce, and you have to have the demand.
And they mutually reinforce each other.
For the people of the world to clear the market of what can be produced by technological instruments, because the technological instruments are going to displace them in their labor contribution to production, which has been the way in which everybody seems to have accepted that's the only way to distribute income to the people, is for them to have a job picking up
wage
leaves.
Labor, which should be looked at properly in a true economic sense.
And they still accept that. They're just looking for the jobs.
Should be looked at as modern-day slavery, which is what we see.
It is. We are slaves. That's why I said we shouldn't say
slavery.
We shouldn't say we're a democracy. We're not.
No,
we are not. We are a plutocracy.
Because of the economic system
and
that
all
we
the
live
world
under,
is,
and the parasitical control, mostly coming out of Wall Street and the Bank of London.
At the moment, it used to be others.
Hong Kong is starting to certainly have an impact, and a say-so in how things are shaped and molded, and they all buy into the same paradigm.
You know what you have with that labor theory of value? You got a lot of others. It's the labor theory of value, and that informs virtually all economic theory in the modern paradigm.
So it's always about jobs.
The economic, the basic pound.
So the Republicans that are going to influence Obama to make a pro-austerity speech tomorrow, talking about we won't run up the deficit more than this X amount of dollars, and we won't give any more aid because we just spent trillions of dollars bailing out the bankers, and now if we run the deficit up, now it becomes an issue. It wasn't a worry when it was for Wall Street.
And they're not going to be
But now that it could potentially be for the people, it's a problem. But either way you go, whether it's Keynesian or whether you go toward the Republican side of cutting back the deficit in the budgets, and you go to supply-side economics, either way you're concentrating, what you're saying is, on jobs. And that's not what we should be concentrating on. We should be concentrating on the distribution of capital and the access and ownership. Sure. Ownership. Well, you have to own something to be able to make money off of it. And this is certainly the structures that we would like to see exist. But what I'm saying is binary economics has arrived at this rationally a conclusion that this is the case, and they've arrived at certain specific institutional means by which this could occur. For one, a national bank, which in turn would have the authority to issue money, but would not have to issue money with interest to a private central bank, which then would be able to issue money to the conventional banks, which could loan out $10 for every $1 that they're issued from the private central bank. So we have this system, and the problem in the cancer in the system is the interest. And the problem that binary economics solves is that it agrees that there should be national banking, because government is a tool for protecting the general welfare of a society.
And there is a
but government can print its money, and it can back its money, or it can do many different things. But one thing that it can do is it can issue money to who it chooses. And the proper channel to issue money and thereby capital to is the people. Primarily. The way the system works now is first dibs on any new issuance of money. Look at the low interest rates and the bubble that it's produced in the stock market. That is not based on anything real. That is just based on speculation and cheap money.
We only got about a minute left.
Well, it went very fast.
We just touched the surface. We went on a lot
of I would like to just say that in Islam, for 1,400 plus years, the concept that I cannot loan you money and make money off of it, the concept of interest-free sharing, called a musharaka or a mudaraba contract, allows us to engage in economic activity that makes us behave like brothers, because if you lose, I lose. And that forms the potential for the development. That forms the potential for development. Now, if we both make money, then you can reap rewards equivalent to what the contemporary monetarist or capitalist system does. And there's many specifics we need to get into.
There is a
but my point is also that at the end of the day, mankind, until it realizes that it has been put here on earth by a greater force, greater than itself, and it starts to organize itself under the derived behavior that comes about from a consciousness that one is going to die, and that one, when they do die, will be resurrected and brought to account for what they do while they're here, then there's no chance that people will stop behaving like monkeys under the capitalist paradigm that it promotes. And this concept that we are competing with one another can be replaced by a concept of brotherhood only under the Islamic paradigm.
Okay, I hear that. Oh, very good.
That's the point I did want to bring into the discussion.
Essentially, Robert Wright writes, well, it's non-zero sum. When you get to a situation where there's enough, you have a different thing. And there is this prescription.
That can exist between Muslims, Christians,
it doesn't have to go into
Jews.
a spiritual.
It doesn't have to
go into any spiritual message. It doesn't have to go there at all. Just materialistic.
I would argue that it does.
Okay, that's all right.
Because if you have a materialist view on what the nature of the human being is, then you're going to have a competitive notion, and this notion that you,
let me say a thing before the thing goes back. Islam has proscribed and is usury. Usury is prescribed by Islamic principles, and that could be informing the modern condition, modern geopolitical reality. No, I know. Yeah, but we've gotten around it in the modern.
We don't agree with the despotic.